Please help me, they hurt my mom. The words came out small and shaking, but in the polished marble lobby of Whitmore Technologies they landed louder than any alarm. Marcus Carter had been pushing a wide yellow mop across the floor, the faint scent of lemon cleaner hanging in the air, when the glass doors burst open and a little girl ran inside like she had outrun a storm. She couldn't have been more than 8. Her shoes squeaked across the marble as she rushed past reception, past the silent security desk, straight toward the one man in the room everyone else had already learned not to notice. Marcus froze with the mop handle in his hands as the girl reached him and grabbed the sleeve of his gray janitor's shirt like it was the only solid thing in the world. Her chest rose and fell in quick breaths, and her voice trembled again. Please, they're at our house. For a moment the building seemed to hold its breath. The massive digital clock above the lobby elevators ticked forward 1 second at a time. A pair of executives paused mid-conversation near the coffee bar. Someone behind the front desk stood halfway out of their chair. The girl looked up at Marcus with wide, glassy eyes that had clearly been crying long before she reached the building. Her blonde hair was slightly tangled, her small backpack hanging off one shoulder like she had thrown it on without thinking. My mom, she needs help. Marcus Carter was used to being invisible in places like this. At 38 years old, he had spent the last 2 years working the night and late afternoon cleaning shifts at Whitmore Technologies, quietly mopping floors, emptying trash bins, fixing light bulbs that nobody noticed until they stopped working. Most employees walked past him without making eye contact. A few nodded politely. Fewer still remembered his name. But Marcus noticed everything. He noticed when someone looked lost in the lobby. He noticed when a new intern looked nervous on their first day. And now he noticed the fear in the voice of the child standing in front of him. He gently leaned the mop against the cleaning cart and knelt down so his eyes were level with hers. Hey, he said softly, careful to keep his voice calm even though something deep in his chest had already tightened. What's your name? Emily, she whispered, clutching his sleeve a little tighter. The name sent a quiet ripple through Marcus's thoughts because there were only a few Emilys connected to this building, and one of them belonged to a man whose photograph hung on the lobby wall beside a plaque listing the company's founders. Richard Whitmore, CEO, billionaire. The girl swallowed hard and looked toward the tall glass windows like she expected someone to appear outside at any moment. My dad isn't home, she said quickly. He's in Singapore for work, and I didn't know where else to go. Marcus glanced toward the front desk, where 2 employees were whispering nervously to each other, unsure whether they should step in. He looked back at Emily and noticed the way her small hands were trembling as they held onto his shirt. The world outside the windows looked normal. Cars moving down the street, sunlight reflecting off nearby office towers, the everyday rhythm of a Tuesday afternoon in downtown Charlotte. But something in the girl's voice said the normal world had already cracked somewhere else. Marcus felt a familiar pull in his chest, the same instinct that had guided him through years of raising his own son alone after life had taken an unexpected turn. Some people saw a janitor. Some saw a man pushing a mop across polished floors. But in that moment Marcus Carter saw only one thing, a child asking for help. Marcus Carter stayed kneeling on the polished marble floor for another moment, studying the small face in front of him the way a father studies a storm cloud before deciding whether to bring his child inside. Emily Whitmore's breathing was still uneven, her fingers gripping the fabric of his sleeve as if letting go might cause the world to spin again. Around them the lobby had returned to a strange half-movement, people whispering quietly, elevator doors opening and closing with soft mechanical chimes, but no one stepping forward. Marcus could feel their eyes drifting toward him, toward the girl, toward the uncomfortable question hanging in the air. He placed one steady hand over hers, not pulling away, not rushing her, just grounding the moment. Emily, he said gently, making sure she heard calm instead of urgency. Take a slow breath for me. You are safe here right now. She tried to follow his voice, inhaling shakily and letting the air out again. The tension in her shoulders eased only a little, but it was enough for Marcus to see the strength beneath the fear. Children carried more courage than most adults realized. They just needed someone to stand still long enough for it to appear. Marcus glanced briefly toward the wall where a framed photograph of Richard Whitmore hung beside the company mission statement. The resemblance was unmistakable. The same bright eyes, the same shape of the chin. This was the daughter of the most powerful man in the building, standing in front of the one employee whose name most people forgot by the end of the week. Life had a strange sense of humor like that. He lowered his voice slightly, so the room around them faded away. "Tell me what happened," he said. Emily swallowed and looked down at the marble floor where faint reflections of the overhead lights shimmered like tiny stars. "Two men came to our house," she said quietly. "Mom thought they were delivery people at first, but they were not supposed to be there." Her words came out carefully, as if she was replaying the memory step by step to make sure she did not get it wrong. Marcus listened without interrupting, his posture still and patient. He had learned years ago that when someone was scared, the worst thing you could do was rush them. Emily continued, her voice soft but determined. "I heard my mom arguing with them in the hallway. She told me to go upstairs and stay in my room, but I could tell something was wrong." She lifted her eyes to meet his again, and the fear there was mixed with something else now. "Responsibility. I took my mom's phone and ran out the back door. I did not know where else to go except here because my dad works here." Marcus felt the quiet weight of those words settle over him. Whitmore Technologies towered over downtown Charlotte like a glass monument to success. But for an 8-year-old girl, it was simply the place where her father worked, the one place that might feel familiar when everything else suddenly stopped making sense. Marcus nodded slowly. "You did exactly the right thing coming here," he said. Emily looked at him as if she needed to believe that more than anything. For the first time since she ran through those doors, her grip loosened slightly on his sleeve. The front desk employees were still watching, unsure whether they should call someone higher up the chain of command. Marcus noticed them, but did not look away from Emily. In moments like this, titles and job descriptions meant very little. What mattered was the person standing in front of you asking for help. Marcus rose carefully to his feet, offering his hand so Emily could stand too. She accepted it without hesitation. Her hand was small and cold, but steady. Marcus glanced once toward the sunlight spilling through the lobby windows, and then back down at the girl beside him. Something about the way she had run straight to him made one thing clear in his mind. Invisible men sometimes became visible at the exact moment the world needed them to. Marcus Carter held the glass lobby door open as the late afternoon sunlight poured across the marble floor and spilled out onto the wide sidewalk beyond Whitmore Technologies. The city moved around them with its usual rhythm. Cars rolling slowly through the intersection, a bus signed to a stop 2 blocks away, office workers crossing the street with coffee cups and briefcases, none of them aware that the small girl beside Marcus had just carried a storm through those glass doors. Emily Whitmore stayed close to him, her backpack strap still clutched in one hand while the other rested lightly in his. She looked smaller outside the towering building, but her eyes kept drifting back toward Marcus as if checking that he was still there. Marcus guided her toward the curb where his old pickup truck was parked between 2 polished sedans that probably cost more than he made in a year. The truck was a faded blue Ford with nearly 180,000 miles on the odometer, the kind of vehicle that had been repaired more times than it had been replaced. To most people walking past, it was just another aging work truck. To Marcus, it was the machine that had carried him through every chapter of his life for the past decade. He opened the passenger door and helped Emily climb inside, making sure the seat belt clicked firmly across her shoulder before he closed the door. When he walked around to the driver's side, he paused for half a second, looking back at the tall glass building reflecting the afternoon sun. Somewhere on the top floor, Richard Whitmore's office stood empty while the man himself was halfway across the world attending meetings in Singapore. Power and distance had a strange relationship. The larger someone's world became, the farther away they often were when something truly important happened. Marcus slid behind the steering wheel and started the engine. The truck hummed to life with a familiar low vibration. Emily sat quietly beside him, her feet barely reaching the floor mat, her eyes following every movement as if trying to understand what came next. Marcus kept his voice steady as he backed out of the parking space. "Emily, where is your house?" he asked gently. She reached into her backpack and pulled out a phone with a bright pink case, unlocking the screen with careful fingers. A map appeared, the small blue dot showing a large property just outside the city in one of the quiet neighborhoods where tall trees lined long private driveways. She turned the phone toward him. "Here," she said softly. Marcus recognized the neighborhood immediately. It was about 12 miles away, a drive that would take around 20 minutes if traffic stayed light. He nodded once and pulled into the street. For the first few minutes, the truck rolled through downtown Charlotte in silence, except for the soft sound of the tires on asphalt. Emily watched the buildings pass by through the window, her small hands folded together in her lap, now that she was no longer gripping his sleeve. Marcus kept his eyes on the road, but his thoughts were moving much faster than the truck. He had learned long ago that when life suddenly dropped a moment like this into your hands, there were two choices. You could step back and wait for someone more important to handle it, or you could step forward even if no one expected you to. Marcus Carter had never been a man who waited for someone else to do the right thing. After a few miles, Emily spoke again, her voice quieter but clearer now. "You believe me, right?" Marcus glanced at her for a moment, and then back at the road ahead, where the city skyline slowly began to fade behind them. "Yes," he said simply. And for the first time since she ran through the lobby doors, Emily Whitmore let out a slow breath like someone who had finally found solid ground. The highway stretched ahead of them in long gray ribbons as Marcus Carter guided the old blue pickup out of downtown Charlotte and toward the quieter neighborhoods beyond the city limits. Traffic thinned the farther they drove, tall office towers slowly giving way to rows of oak trees and wide suburban roads where the afternoon sun filtered through branches and flickered across the windshield. Inside the truck, the air felt calmer than it had 20 minutes earlier, but the tension had not disappeared completely. Emily Whitmore sat quietly in the passenger seat, her hands now resting on the pink phone in her lap, while the navigation map glowed softly on the screen. Every few seconds, she glanced at the road ahead, then back at Marcus, as if measuring the distance between hope and whatever waited at the end of the drive. Marcus kept both hands steady on the steering wheel, the familiar hum of the engine beneath him helping his mind stay focused. He had learned in life that when a situation was uncertain, the most important thing a person could offer was calm. Panic helped no one. Calm allowed people to think. A red traffic light appeared ahead, and Marcus eased the truck to a stop. The quiet tick of the turn signal filled the cab for a moment. Emily looked out the window toward a small gas station on the corner where a man was filling his truck while talking on his phone, completely unaware of the story unfolding just a few yards away. "Is it far?" she asked softly. Marcus shook his head. "About 8 more miles," he said. "We will be there soon." Emily nodded slowly, absorbing the answer like a promise she wanted to believe. The light turned green, and the truck rolled forward again. As the road curved into a wooded residential area, the houses grew larger and farther apart, long driveways disappearing behind iron gates and thick hedges. Marcus recognized the neighborhood immediately. Places like this were built for privacy. Tall trees shielded wide lawns, and security cameras watched from quiet corners. The Whitmore home appeared on the map a few turns ahead. Emily suddenly leaned forward slightly in her seat, pointing through the windshield. "That road," she said, her voice tightening just a little. Marcus slowed the truck and turned onto a quiet private lane lined with towering pines that cast long shadows across the pavement. The world seemed quieter here, almost too quiet, the distant city noise replaced by the soft rustle of wind through branches. At the end of the lane, a large stone gate stood open, revealing the long driveway that led toward the Whitmore house. Marcus guided the truck through the entrance and rolled forward slowly, his eyes carefully scanning the property ahead. The house itself rose beyond the trees, a large white structure with tall windows and wide front steps that looked peaceful in the afternoon light. From a distance, everything appeared normal. No flashing lights, no broken glass, just a quiet home sitting beneath the Carolina sky. But Marcus noticed something Emily had not yet said out loud. The front door stood slightly open. The truck came to a gentle stop near the circular driveway fountain. Marcus turned off the engine, and the sudden silence inside the cab felt heavier than the drive itself. Emily looked toward the house, her fingers tightening around the phone again. Marcus rested one hand lightly on the dashboard for a moment before speaking. "Emily," he said calmly, "you stay right here until I tell you it is safe to come out." She looked at him, searching his face the way children do when they need to know whether an adult truly means what they say. Marcus gave a small, reassuring nod. Outside the truck, the wind moved softly through the tall trees, and the open front door of the Whitmore home waited quietly at the end of the driveway. Marcus Carter opened the truck door slowly, the quiet click of the handle sounding louder than it should have in the still afternoon air. For a brief moment he remained seated, studying the house through the windshield, letting his eyes move across every detail the way a careful man reads a page twice before turning it. The Whitmore home stood tall and elegant beyond the circular fountain, white columns catching the late sunlight, while shadows from the surrounding pine trees stretched across the front lawn. On the surface, everything looked calm, but Marcus had lived long enough to understand that calm could sometimes hide the truth just beneath it. He stepped out of the truck and closed the door gently so the sound would not echo across the quiet driveway. The wind moved softly through the trees overhead, carrying the faint scent of freshly cut grass from somewhere nearby. Behind him inside the truck, Emily Whitmore watched through the passenger window, her small face pressed slightly toward the glass. Marcus turned back to her and raised one hand in a simple signal that meant wait. She nodded immediately, understanding the instruction without needing it repeated. Marcus walked toward the front steps at a steady pace, each footstep measured and quiet against the stone path. As he reached the open door, he paused for a moment, listening. The house itself was large, easily more than 6,000 square feet, with tall ceilings and wide hallways designed to impress visitors. From the outside, it felt almost like a museum, beautiful but distant. Marcus rested one hand lightly on the edge of the door and pushed it open a little farther. The interior was dimmer than the bright afternoon outside, the cool air of the house carrying a faint echo of movement somewhere deeper inside. He stepped just across the threshold and called out in a calm voice, "Hello, Mrs. Whitmore." His words traveled through the high ceiling of the foyer and disappeared down the hallway without an answer. Marcus listened again. Somewhere in the distance he heard voices, low and tense, but not loud enough to clearly understand. He followed the sound slowly down the long hallway, passing framed photographs on the walls that showed the Whitmore family through the years. In one picture, Richard Whitmore stood beside Laura Whitmore at a charity event, both smiling beneath bright lights. In another, Emily appeared younger, sitting on her father's shoulders during what looked like a summer fair. Marcus paused briefly at the image, recognizing the same determined eyes that had looked up at him in the lobby only an hour earlier. The voices ahead became clearer as he moved closer to the living room. Marcus stopped just before the wide archway that opened into the space. Inside, he could see Laura Whitmore standing near a large table, while two unfamiliar men faced her across the room. Their conversation sounded sharp and tense, the kind of conversation where every word carried weight. Marcus did not rush forward. Instead, he took a slow breath and stepped into the doorway, so his presence was impossible to miss. The three adults turned toward him almost at the same moment. One of the men looked surprised, the other confused, and Laura Whitmore blinked in disbelief as if trying to understand why a janitor from her husband's company was suddenly standing inside her home. Marcus kept his voice calm and steady. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "your daughter is safe outside." The room fell quiet after those words, and in that silence the balance of the moment began to shift in a way none of them had expected. Laura Whitmore stared at Marcus Carter for a long moment, as if her mind needed time to accept what her eyes were seeing. The elegant living room around them remained perfectly arranged, sunlight filtering through tall windows and falling across polished wooden floors, yet the air inside the space carried the tension of a conversation that had already stretched too far. The two men standing across from her slowly turned their attention toward Marcus, studying him from head to toe with the puzzled expressions of people trying to understand how someone like him had appeared in a place like this. Marcus did not move farther into the room. He simply stood in the doorway, shoulders relaxed, his hands visible at his sides. Years of quiet work had taught him something important about difficult situations. Calm presence could change the direction of a room faster than raised voices ever could. Laura took a step toward him, her voice controlled but shaken. "Emily is outside?" she asked. Marcus nodded once. "She is sitting in my truck. She is safe." For a brief second, the strength in Laura Whitmore's posture softened with visible relief. A mother's first concern had been answered. She closed her eyes for half a heartbeat as if steadying herself before opening them again. The taller of the two men cleared his throat and glanced toward Marcus with open irritation. "Who exactly are you supposed to be?" he asked, his tone edged with the quiet arrogance of someone accustomed to controlling the conversation. Marcus met the man's gaze without raising his voice. "My name is Marcus Carter." He paused just long enough for the words to settle in the room. I work at Whitmore Technologies. The second man gave a short laugh that did not carry any humor. A janitor, he said, as if the word itself explained why Marcus should not be standing there. Marcus did not react to the remark. He had heard variations of that tone many times before in life, and he had long ago decided that other people's opinions did not define the weight of a moment. Laura Whitmore lifted one hand slightly, signaling the men to stop speaking. Her attention returned to Marcus. "You brought her here?" she asked. Marcus nodded again. "She came to the office looking for help. She knew her father worked there." The room grew quieter after that. Outside the wide front windows, the afternoon sun had begun to lower toward the horizon, painting the trees with long golden streaks of light. Marcus could sense the shift taking place in the room. Laura Whitmore was no longer looking at him as a stranger who had stepped into her home without invitation. She was looking at the man who had answered her daughter when no one else had been there to do it. The taller man shifted his weight impatiently and glanced toward the open hallway, as if considering whether this interruption had changed the situation. Marcus noticed the movement without appearing to study it. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said calmly, "your daughter is waiting for you." Laura's eyes softened at those words, and for the first time since Marcus had stepped into the house, the tension in her shoulders began to ease. She took another step toward the doorway, the quiet strength returning to her voice. "Then I think this conversation is finished." The statement hung in the air with unmistakable clarity. The two men exchanged a brief glance, suddenly aware that whatever control they believed they had in this room had quietly begun to disappear the moment a man no one expected walked through the door and spoke only one simple truth. The child outside was safe. For a moment no one moved. The quiet inside the Whitmore living room stretched thin like glass under pressure. Laura Whitmore walked slowly toward the doorway where Marcus Carter stood, her steps measured but determined, the tension in her face giving way to something steadier now that she knew her daughter was outside and safe. The two men remained near the center of the room, their confidence fading into irritation as the situation slipped beyond their control. The taller man straightened his jacket and looked toward Marcus again with a tight expression. "This is not your business," he said, his voice low and controlled, as if he expected the statement alone to end the interruption. Marcus did not raise his voice or step closer. He simply met the man's gaze with the calm patience of someone who had already decided he would not move unless the moment required it. "A child asked for help," Marcus replied quietly. "That makes it my business." The second man gave a short breath of disbelief, glancing toward his partner before looking back at Laura Whitmore. "We were having a private discussion," he said, trying to regain the authority that had been slowly slipping away since Marcus entered the house. Laura stopped beside Marcus and looked directly at the two men. The calm in her voice carried far more weight than anger would have. "That discussion is over," she said firmly. Outside, the soft sound of wind moved through the tall trees that lined the driveway. The open front door allowed the cool afternoon air to drift gently into the foyer, bringing with it the quiet reminder that Emily Whitmore was waiting just a few yards away. Marcus stepped aside slightly so Laura could pass through the doorway. She gave him a small nod of gratitude before walking toward the truck. Through the wide living room windows, Marcus could see Emily sitting inside the passenger seat, her eyes fixed on the front steps, as if she had been counting every second since he left. The moment Laura appeared outside, the truck door opened, and Emily jumped down, running toward her mother without hesitation. Laura knelt and wrapped her arms around the girl, holding her close while whispering something only Emily could hear. The tension that had filled the house began to dissolve in that quiet reunion. Behind Marcus, the taller man exhaled impatiently and walked toward the hallway. "This is finished," he muttered, clearly eager to leave the situation behind. The second man followed, casting one last puzzled look toward Marcus before stepping out of the house. The sound of their car doors closing echoed faintly from the driveway a few seconds later. Marcus remained near the doorway, giving the mother and daughter space. He watched as Laura helped Emily back into the truck for a moment, speaking softly to her while brushing a strand of hair away from the girl's face. Emily looked toward Marcus and gave him a small wave through the windshield. Marcus returned the gesture with a gentle nod. A few minutes later, Laura walked back toward the front steps. The relief in her expression had replaced the tension that filled the room earlier. She stopped in front of Marcus, studying him as if trying to understand how a man who spent his days cleaning floors had just changed the course of her afternoon. "Mr. Carter," she said quietly, "I do not know how to thank you." Marcus shook his head slightly, the same calm presence still surrounding him. "You already did," he replied, glancing toward the truck where Emily waited safely inside. "Your daughter trusted that someone would help. That was enough." And in that simple answer, Laura Whitmore began to realize that the man standing in her doorway had never been invisible at all. He had simply been the kind of person most people only noticed when it mattered the most. The quiet driveway of the Whitmore home seemed to breathe again after the unfamiliar car disappeared down the road and the sound of its engine faded into the distance. The afternoon sun had shifted lower now, painting long golden shadows across the lawn and reflecting softly off the fountain in the circular drive. Marcus Carter stepped down from the front porch and walked toward the pickup truck where Emily Whitmore sat waiting, her small hands resting on the dashboard as if she had been watching every moment unfold. Laura Whitmore followed a few steps behind him, her expression calmer than it had been earlier, though the weight of the day still lingered in her eyes. When Marcus reached the truck, he opened the passenger door gently. Emily turned toward him immediately. "Is everything okay now?" she asked, her voice careful but hopeful. Marcus gave a small, reassuring nod. "Your mom is right here," he said softly. Laura stepped forward and placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder. Emily leaned toward her instantly, the quiet trust between them filling the space more clearly than any words could. Laura helped her daughter climb out of the truck for a moment, holding her close again as if making sure the world had truly settled back into place. After a few seconds, Emily looked up toward Marcus. "Thank you for believing me," she said. Marcus smiled slightly, the same calm expression that had guided him through the entire afternoon. "You did the brave part," he replied. "You asked for help." Emily seemed to consider that for a moment before nodding in quiet agreement. Laura turned toward Marcus again, the gratitude in her voice now deeper and steadier. "Mr. Carter, I would like to make sure my husband knows what you did today." Marcus shook his head gently. "That is not necessary," he said. "Anyone would have helped." Laura looked at him carefully for a moment before answering. "Not everyone would have listened the way you did." The words hung quietly between them. Marcus glanced toward the fading sunlight beyond the trees and then back at the truck. His shift at Whitmore Technologies would still be waiting when he returned, the same mop bucket and polished floors that had started the day like any other. But the rhythm of the afternoon had already changed something far larger than a schedule. Emily climbed back into the passenger seat while Laura closed the door and leaned slightly toward the open window. "Drive safely, Mr. Carter," she said. Marcus nodded and walked around the truck once more. As the engine started again, the soft vibration filled the quiet driveway. Emily lifted her hand and gave him another small wave through the window. Marcus returned the gesture before guiding the pickup slowly back down the long driveway toward the open gate. In the rearview mirror, he could see Laura Whitmore standing beside the fountain, watching the truck disappear through the trees. She stood there for several seconds after the vehicle was gone, her thoughts already moving toward the conversation she would have later that evening when her husband returned from across the world. Because when Richard Whitmore heard the story of the day his daughter ran through the glass doors of his company looking for help, there would be one name he would remember above all the others. And it would not belong to a board member, an executive, or a man with a title printed on an office door. It would belong to the quiet janitor who chose to listen when a child asked for help. The city lights of Charlotte were beginning to glow when Marcus Carter pulled his old blue pickup back into the parking lot behind Whitmore Technologies. The building looked almost identical to how it had earlier that afternoon, its tall glass walls reflecting the fading orange sky, employees still moving in and out of the front entrance as the evening shift changed. To everyone else, the day had probably felt ordinary. Meetings had started and ended. Emails had been sent. Coffee cups had been emptied and thrown away. But Marcus knew that somewhere across the city a little girl was sitting safely at home because she had trusted a stranger to listen. He turned off the engine and sat for a moment in the quiet truck cab, watching the building through the windshield. The faint hum of traffic drifted through the air from the street beyond the parking lot. After a few seconds, Marcus stepped out of the truck and walked toward the service entrance where his cleaning cart still waited in the hallway exactly where he had left it earlier. The bright fluorescent lights inside the building felt almost too ordinary after everything that had happened. Marcus rolled the cart forward and filled the mop bucket again, the familiar scent of lemon cleaner rising from the water as he dipped the mop head inside. The polished floors of the hallway reflected the lights above him as he began working once more, his steady movements blending quietly into the rhythm of the evening. To anyone passing by, it looked like nothing unusual had happened at all. But on the top floor of the building, something had already begun to shift. Several hours later, a black sedan pulled into the circular drive of the Whitmore home. Richard Whitmore stepped out, still wearing the dark suit he had traveled halfway across the world in, his face showing the fatigue of a long flight. Laura Whitmore met him at the door, and within minutes the quiet living room filled with the careful retelling of everything that had happened that afternoon. Richard listened without interrupting, his expression growing more serious with each detail. When Laura reached the part about their daughter running into the company lobby and finding help from a janitor named Marcus Carter, Richard Whitmore leaned back slightly in his chair, repeating the name softly, as if committing it to memory. The next morning, the glass doors of Whitmore Technologies opened just as they always did. Employees crossed the lobby carrying coffee cups and laptops, conversations echoing beneath the tall ceiling. Marcus Carter pushed his cleaning cart across the marble floor, focused on the quiet routine that had defined most of his days. He did not notice the moment the front elevator doors opened and Richard Whitmore stepped out into the lobby. The chief executive of the entire company walked across the floor until he stood beside the man holding the mop handle. Marcus looked up, surprised to see the man whose photograph hung on the wall above them. Richard Whitmore extended his hand without hesitation. "Mr. Carter," he said calmly, "my daughter told me everything." For a moment Marcus simply looked at the offered hand, then shook it with the same steady calm he had carried through the entire day before. Around them the busy lobby slowed as people quietly noticed the unexpected scene. Richard Whitmore did not raise his voice, but the sincerity in his tone carried clearly through the room. "Thank you for being the kind of man who listens when a child asks for help." Marcus nodded once, slightly embarrassed by the attention but unmoved by the praise. "She was brave enough to ask," he replied. Richard Whitmore studied him for a moment, and then gave a small smile before turning toward the elevators again. The lobby slowly returned to its usual rhythm, but one thing had changed forever. The man most people had once walked past without noticing was now someone the entire building would remember. And Marcus Carter simply returned to his work, pushing the mop across the shining floor with the same quiet dignity he had always carried, proving that sometimes the strongest heroes are the ones who never needed anyone to see them at all.